The most significant public statement so far, I mean, before this meeting, when Prime Minister Modi met President Putin and famously said, "This is not the era of war." When the Bucha massacre happened in 2022, India called for an international probe, which is again a very big major step for the Indian Prime Minister to visit Russia beyond the neighborhood is an important signal to Russia. The Prime Minister raised that issue with President Putin, where he said that it was heart-wrenching and painful to see when innocent children are killed or die, and that was seen as a very strong message to President Putin.
Hello, readers, listeners, and viewers of the Indian Express. I am Flora Swain, and with me today we have the diplomatic editor of the Indian Express, Shubhajit Roy, and we are going to discuss Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to Russia. Shubhajit, the Prime Minister is currently on a 2-day trip to Russia. He's looking to bolster the ties between the two countries and talk about the multifaceted relationship that we have with the Russians. So can you give us a broader overview of how India-Russia ties have been over the years and over the decades and how they have diversified?
Well, India-Russia ties date back to 1947, after India became independent. Soviet Union at that point of time was one of the major superpowers in the world, and India developed a deep relationship with the Soviet Union under Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, right. India's first Prime Minister. And at that point of time, India needed sort of its for its food security, for its weapons, for a lot of humanitarian aid India needed, assistance India needed. Also, India, a newly independent country, needed technology, needed help to set up institutions. So from IITs to new dams to new power stations, so steel plants, so a lot of this infrastructure that came up, Soviet Union was at the forefront giving out help to India.
Right.
In the 1962 war with China, however, Soviet Union did not come out in support of India. At that point of time, you have to remember, China was a fellow communist country.
Correct.
At that point of time, so it did not come out in support of India. But in 1971, when India-Pakistan war over liberation of Bangladesh, after which and Bangladesh was born, because before that it was East Pakistan. It was Russian support, in terms of because India and Russia at that point of time signed a friendship treaty. And so the Soviet help and the Soviet Union standing by India, supporting India, really deterred US from actively supporting Pakistan at that point of time. A famous story goes where US was moving its shipping fleet towards East Pakistan, but they were deterred because Soviet Union sort of gave a messaging that if US actively supported Pakistan, Soviet Union would also come into the picture supporting India. So that kind of ties relationship really cemented the relationship. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, although India's goodwill towards Soviet Union really transferred to Russia. But Russia became a different country after that. It was no more a major superpower after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And India's relationship with Russia, with the Russian Federation, became much more transactional. And the India-Russia relationship sort of maintained because in defense area, because 60 to 70% of India's defense equipment is of Soviet origin.
Right.
And so you need to service them for the spare parts, you need a resilient supply of the spare parts. So all these became a big element of the relationship. Apart from that, the new element that has come up is in the field of energy sector, where the Russia-Ukraine war in the last couple of years has made sure that India has started importing more Russian oil because it got them at discounted prices, whereas the global market was showing volatility at that point of time. So India needed cheap Russian oil to cushion the inflationary impact on its consumers. So you and I don't have to pay a higher premium on our oil, on petrol, diesel.
Correct.
And similarly, farmers who depend on on cheaper fuel, or anyone in this country who relies on fuel needs them at a certain price point. That was possible because India was buying Russian oil at discounted prices. And in fact, that became a major driver for India-Russia trade in the last 2 years. In fact, it has now, the India-Russia bilateral trade has touched about $65 billion, which was, the target for India-Russia bilateral trade was somewhere around $30 billion. But in the last 2 years, it really galloped to this level. So defense and energy are now the key areas, key baskets for the relationship. And so that gives you a sense of how India and Russia have cooperated in the last 7.5 decades or more. And this visit by Prime Minister Modi has to be seen in that context of that bilateral cooperation.
Of course, but at the same time, there is so much talk about how significant and crucial this visit is, especially for Modi after the Ukraine war commenced in February 2022. This is his first visit. I think Modi last visited Russia in 2019, and Putin visited India in 2021, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah.
So, in context of the Russia-Ukraine war, how significant do you think is Modi's visit?
With Russia, India has had a bilateral annual summit, which India has had with only one other country, which is Japan.
Okay.
So that was institutionalized. With Russia, it was institutionalized in the year 2000, when Putin became the president of Russia. And Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who was then Prime Minister, they met and sort of agreed on this annual bilateral summit mechanism. So far there have been 21 summits. There should have been 24, but because of COVID years, there was some break in that. But despite that, I think the two sides have maintained this bilateral summit process. It got interrupted because first COVID, and then because of the war. Actually, the war, because the war started in February 2022, and Putin just came just 3 months before that, in December 2021, at that point of time. And so India had to sort of balance its interests and with Russia on one side, and the US-led Western bloc on the other side. So it had to, do the diplomatic balancing act between the two sides. And that's why India was careful in not scheduling a visit. But it had become about 3 years now, almost going to be almost 2.5 years now. And India thought that one should again resume the bilateral summit because there have been 21 summits so far between India and Russia since it started in 2000. This is the 22nd annual bilateral summit. And India thought that it needs to, because it's two of its elements, defense is very important for India.
Absolutely.
Because at a time when India and China, they are locked in a border standoff, there are 50 to 60,000 troops from both sides, Indian troops and Chinese troops, which are stationed along the India-China border in the line of actual control. And it's been on since 2020. So 4 years, and this is the 5th year running. At this point, India cannot risk having a situation where its major defense partner or supplier is not supplying spare parts. So it has to keep a strategic relationship, a defense relationship ongoing, and it needs to have that visit or that working mechanism going on at the highest level, not just at the official level or the military to military level, but also at the highest level. So therefore, Indian government decided that one should schedule this visit because you want President Putin by your side. And and President Putin and Russia has been growing closer to China, especially since the war. Even before the war, that strategic proximity was growing between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping. Now, India doesn't want this growing bonhomie between Russia and China to impact India-Russia relationship. That tomorrow, if there is a conflict like situation, so keeping in mind that strategic imperative, the Indian side decided to schedule the Prime Minister's visit to Russia. And the other aspect is obviously the energy basket is also very important for Indian consumers, and the Indian government is mindful of that is really brought stability in the market, not just in India but also in the global supply chain.
Absolutely. On one hand, like you mentioned, that we need Russia on our side when it comes to our energy basket, when it comes to our defense equipments, and therefore India has abstained a lot of times from voting against Russia in many resolutions of the UN Security Council. But on the other hand, you have I think Prime Minister Narendra Modi is probably one of the very few leaders who's both in touch with Putin and Zelensky. India has condoned war, mass casualties all the time. Prime Minister Modi during the G7 summit also, reassured Zelensky that, something will be done, though he did not come out and say anything explicitly. But it is a tightrope situation for India, isn't it?
Yeah, in the last 2.5 years, ever since the Russia-Ukraine war started, after Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, India has not explicitly condemned Russia, but it has made its views known.
Yes.
Some publicly, much of it privately. So the most significant public statement so far, before this meeting, was in September 2022 in Samarkand, when Prime Minister Modi met President Putin and famously said, "This is not the era of war."
Yes.
And that was seen as a polite rebuke to the Russian president, and which became in fact a catchphrase which was used in the G20 declaration, which was used by other world leaders to press Russia to end the war.
Right.
India, although India did not condemn Russia, it when the Bucha massacre happened in 2022, India called for an international probe,
Yeah.
which is again a very big major step from Indian perspective. India never calls for an international probe, especially when within a territory of a third country, because that opens up India also to a similar international probe tomorrow if there is an incident in, say, Kashmir,
Yeah.
or in Manipur or any other part of the country.
Yeah.
Then there could be calls for an international probe.
Yeah.
So India doesn't open up that front. So the fact that India raised that issue showed that India took that risk, but it wanted to make a point against Russia. Also, India raised issues concerning the nuclear security when there were nuclear threats given out by President Putin and the top leaders from Russia. That was of concern to the entire world,
Right.
and that was also seen as a polite sort of a message from the Indian side to the Russian side. So all these, if you see, India had made it a point without using the same language or template that the Western leaders were using. At the same time, India was also keeping up with the Russian oil purchases, keeping up with the defense supplies, but at the same time also supplying humanitarian aid to Ukraine.
Yeah.
It sent tons of medical equipment or of medicines and other stuff, also to some children's school in Ukraine. It supplied some objects, some commodities. So it tried to maintain a balancing act between the two sides, but it was becoming increasingly difficult.
Yes.
In fact, in Prime Minister Modi's meeting with Putin, it came just right after, a day after the, in fact, hours after the attack, Russian missile strike.
The children's hospital in Kyiv.
At the children's hospital in Kyiv. And the Prime Minister raised that issue with President Putin, where he said that it is heart-wrenching and painful to see when innocent children are killed or die. And that was seen as a very strong message to President Putin. Also, the Indian Prime Minister said that the dialogue and diplomacy should be the path forward, which has been the template. The Indian position earlier, but it also talked about the fact that solutions to these problems can't be found on the battlefield,
Right.
which is again a new framing, a bit more than what he had said earlier when he had said this is not the era of war. So I think all in all, Indian government has tried to balance the two sides, but the Russian president has been extremely disappointed with the current meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Putin. In fact, he called it a huge disappointment and said that this has a devastating impact when the world's largest democracy in the world, the leader of I'll in fact read out the
Zelensky's
social media post where he said that it's a huge disappointment and devastating blow to peace efforts.
Right.
And he said that it's efforts to see the leader of the world's largest democracy hug the world's most bloody criminal in Moscow on such a day.
Yeah.
This was on a day when, in Ukraine today, 37 people were killed, 3 of whom were children, and 170 are injured. including 13 children in this missile strike. Russia obviously has denied and said that this is a Ukrainian
Anti-missile.
which has caused which has struck the hospital. So India has tried to balance the two sides, and knowing fully well that it is a tough task.
Since Modi became prime minister to up until this point, Modi and Putin have met 16 times. And apparently, this time, Modi has broken tradition after becoming prime minister. And his first foreign trip, instead of visiting a neighboring country that he did the previous last times, I think the first time he went to Bhutan and the second time he went to Maldives and Sri Lanka. But this time he broke tradition, he went to Russia. But Shubhajit, Putin, on the other hand, after his re-election in March, he chose China as his first foreign trip. So, do you think this sends a clear message somewhere about where India and where China stand on the priority list of Putin, or nothing can be said?
Both have very different relationships. First is India-Russia relationship has, as I mentioned earlier, that it has had a broad broad trajectory over 7.5 decades, from erstwhile Soviet Union to present day Russia, and it has right now, if you see the trade basket, with all the energy imports and everything, it's around $65 billion. India-Russia bilateral trade. The Russia-China bilateral trade is about $240 billion. So
that's a huge gap.
Yeah. So the point being that both relationships are at different levels. The Russian president meeting the Chinese president in his first visit, and then meeting him again last week, the second time in 4 months, doesn't surprise, shouldn't surprise us.
Okay.
But yes, for the Indian Prime Minister to visit Russia beyond the neighborhood is an important signal to Russia as well, that it is prioritizing Russian bilateral ties, so that Russia also prioritizes India and does not let its relationship with China impact the India-Russia ties. Absolutely. So that's the message, I think, signal that it goes. But economically speaking, Russia is much more dependent on China, not as much dependent on India. India is one of the major trading partners of Russia right now, but China is way ahead. So if you see the Russian economic dependence, from that perspective, from the Russian perspective, China has to be the number one partner. So in that, and this, I think India has been conveying or making this point to the Western counterparts, Western leaders, not just in the last 2.5 years, but much before, that Western sanctions on Russia and Western approach towards of engaging with Russia or not engaging with Russia has pushed Russia to the arms of Beijing. So India has always conveyed this message to a lot of Western leaders, US presidents, British prime ministers, French presidents, and over time, any other Western leader who cared to listen, that it is because of their approach, Russia is moving towards China. Now, West has always said it is because of Russia's own actions that West has had to take those steps. But India has always been in favor of engaging with Russia rather than putting sanctions, and that's why India has always chosen sort of to engage with Russia bilaterally despite a lot of pressures from the Western partners, who are very trusted partners for India, because India needs the capital, investments, technology,
Right.
and West is despite it has been a source of capital and investment and technology, but it has also been a preferred destination for Indians, for Indian students, Indian professionals. So India has sort of interests on both sides. So in that sense, India has tried to engage with Russia, and it has also told the Americans and the Western partners why it is engaging with Russia, despite having good interests or very important interests with the West. So India-Russia relationship. So Russia understands that India is concerned about Russia's relationship with China,
Yeah.
and it has so far been able to balance and been able to not let that relationship with China impact its relationship with India.
Right.
But we'll only have to see when a crisis comes how that plays out.
Plays out.
And lastly, I think globally, uh, it's not a zero sum game to engage with Russia, and therefore it is enemies with others. I think world politics, like human relationships, are complicated, and it's not like one is completely friends with someone. One is the government or the India must look after its own national interests. Visit.
All right. So that was our diplomatic editor, Shubhajit Roy. Please visit our website, indianexpress.com, for all the deep dive pieces on all the global news and all the articles by Shubhajit Roy. I am Flora Swain, and you are watching the official YouTube channel of the Indian Express.